and the mission behind all of this is to introduce or share this idea of the power of making a promise with millions of people around the world. And for those of you who are new to this, I'll tell you very briefly my own promise story, and then I'll introduce our guests, because that's really what this program is all about, is get these promises from our guests. But just to remind you, I made a promise to my mother on her deathbed. I sometimes get a little choked up about this. I made a promise to my mother on her deathbed that I would finish writing a book that she and I had been talking about for a while, and she was encouraging me to finish the book. And I made a promise to her. It was spontaneous. I hadn't really thought about this in advance, but I decided I was going to make a promise that I would finish writing this book and dedicate it to her memory. And her face lit up, and she smiled and encouraged me to do it. She said, "Matthew, you do that. You do that." So I knew at the time that this was a promise that I would have to keep. I would have to fulfill it. I had crossed the Rubicon. I made a promise to my mother. Failure was not an option. And so the book I wrote with the dedication to my mother was called Habit Force, and I don't want to talk a lot about Habit Force, but the whole point here is that after I made that promise and kept my word on that, it has dawned on me more recently that there is a unique power in making a promise. And I often say that a promise is like a goal on steroids. And so in the course of these programs, I talk a little bit more about some of those ideas, and I also get the stories about promises made and promises kept from real people, and that's really what the What's Your Promise program is all about. So all of that is just preliminary to introducing our guest today. And I'm delighted to welcome our guest, who, as I mentioned, is based in Hong Kong. Her name is Stefania Lucchetti. Sure sounds like Italian heritage to me. My name is Cosolotto, so it looks like Italian.
It is Italian.
It sure does, yeah, even though you're in Hong Kong.
Yes, but I'm Italian.
What? I'm sorry?
I'm Italian originally.
Yes, I thought you were, yeah, that's what I thought. So Stefania is an internationally known expert on leadership and productivity, and I kind of like this phrase, making ideas happen. She makes ideas happen. But she's a leadership expert. She's a very popular speaker and empowerment leader and coach, and she's got several books out there, and we can talk about that. I really want to have Stefania tell us a little bit more about her own background. But the big question that I always ask all of my guests is this: Stefania, what's your promise? What promise do you want to tell us about? And you can ease into it. I know there are a couple of promises that you want to talk about, but there's probably one in particular. I think I heard about a promise that you made to your grandmother. But let's just talk a little bit about one of your promises, and then maybe we'll talk about two or three of them. So Stefania, welcome, and what's your promise?
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. It's great to be talking to you. And this make a promise philosophy really resonates with me. As you were saying, yes, I did make a big promise several years ago, and that was when my grandmother was still alive, and I had a really, really strong relationship with her. When I was a little kid, I loved to read, and I loved to write, and I thought that I wanted to be a writer. And I also loved to dance. I was a showgirl. Basically, I thought that on top of being a writer, I also wanted to be a dancer or a showgirl of some kind, an actress or a singer, whatever, just showgirl.
And this was in Italy?
This was in Italy, yes.
Okay.
And then I grew up, and then I decided to go to law school and become a lawyer and do the whole corporate career journey, which was fine. But I at the same time, there were lots of things about me that I was giving up by making that choice. So one day my grandmother said to me, well, it's all great that you want to be a lawyer and you're going to do great things, but at the same time, don't forget, promise me, that you won't forget that your passion is writing and that your passion is performing.
Yeah.
There's two things. Promise me that at some point, you will do something with them. And I said, okay, I promise. And I didn't really believe it then. I thought that there was no way that I could ever make this happen, but I promised to her, and I thought, well, I'll just see how things go. And then at some point, I've been a lawyer for over 10 years. But at some point, a few years ago, I decided that I was a bit tired with it, and the experience that I had in the corporate world had made me realize how actually there were other things that I wanted to do and other things that I wanted to contribute to the world on top of the fact that I had created and structured big corporate deals and commercial deals. I wanted to do something else. And then I remembered how much I loved writing. And one day I went back to my computer and I saw that there wasn't a month or a year where I wasn't starting a new book or a new novel or something new or a poem. And they were all stored in my computer, and I just wasn't doing anything with them. And at the same time, my showgirl soul was kicking because I've been a semi-professional dancer for a few years when I was in university, and then I gave it up because I couldn't manage it with my corporate career. I still was teaching some dance classes, but it was far from what nurtured me in terms of my showgirl soul. And then I remembered this promise that I made to my grandmother, and I thought, well, what could I do right now that could put all of these things together? What could I do that could make this happen? And so I decided that writing didn't necessarily have to be about fiction. And I'm saying this because being a lawyer for over 10 years basically does cut down a little bit on your creativity. It's a little bit harder to write a whole novel. I was writing stories, but I didn't think I had the mental bandwidth at the time to write novels. But I could very easily write nonfiction. So I thought, let me start with nonfiction and let me put into words some of the experiences I've had in my career, and let me contribute with the skills that I have. So I wrote my first book, which is The Principle of Relevance, and it's a book about information overload and digital information ethics. I've been a lawyer in the technology world, so that was very fitting with my background. Yeah. And there I fulfilled my first promise that I wouldn't stop writing. And, as you know, and once you publish a book, then there's something else that you need to do or that people start asking you to do, and that is that you start speaking. You start doing public speaking. You start presenting. And first I started presenting my book, and then it all evolved into keynote talks and teaching at universities and developing other topics. And then I wrote another book, and I started speaking more. And I really feel, at some point I realized that the speaking side that I was I was doing so well, I love it, was basically channeling my showgirl, showgirl soul. And there I realized that I was really fulfilling that promise that I had made, and it was a very happy moment.
Yeah, so let me just put a little frame around this, because it sounds like that the promise that you made, now your grandmother actually asked you to promise, which is really kind of a nice way. You were prompted to promise, and what you promised was that you would pursue your purpose or your passions in life, which is kind of an interesting, those two things that you already knew you wanted to do, but you had sort of gotten away from. So it sort of brought you back to kind of the real purpose in your life, or your passions anyway. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I have begun to write a little bit about in terms of promises. I have, and I think you'll find this interesting. I think in terms of the anatomy of promises, I think there are two categories that I recommend. One is that you turn a goal into a promise, and a goal might be simply like I did with a book. I'm going to write a book and turn that into a promise so that you make sure you achieve it, because a promise, I think, is more binding, more powerful. The other kind is a little bit closer to what you did, which was, I refer to them as personal empowerment promises. And it's almost like getting in touch with your passions and making promises around things that you are really passionate about and interested in, and improving your life in some way, or making your life on purpose. So it sounds like that was closer to what you were promising your grandmother, a little bit more of what I call personal empowerment, or a purpose promise.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is an interesting thing, and it's very powerful, because if it aligns with your purpose, then you're going to be drawn to it naturally. But it took you a few years to get back to it.
Exactly. Yeah. To get back to it. Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point. I agree with you, because you're going to be drawn to it if it aligns to your purpose. But it is a way to remember, to be reminded that, and to have a very specific thing in mind, to have a very specific goal in mind, to be accountable for it to someone, even though she wasn't there to remind me, because she died a few years later. It was always there, like it was always in my mind that that I made that promise. And also, I felt a lot of satisfaction by being able to think that she would have been happy if she had known.
Yeah.
So that's the power of the promise.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, because what's interesting about a promise, and a number of things I say about promises, for instance, you can change a goal, but you can only break a promise. And that's a kind of an interesting thing. A promise is a promise. I mean, it is something that you, and it may be in the case of your grandmother, you promised that you would pursue these passions, the things that she knew made you happy. And she wanted you to be happy in your life, and that's what she wanted you to get back on track in a way. And so she's reminding you of that. And so that promise, or any promise, has the quality, I think, of helping people stay on track over time in a way that a goal might sort of dissipate, or you might change it, or you might not feel that strongly about it. But a promise, particularly to someone you care about, which is another way to think about these. When you make a promise to someone you care about, you've got that accountability issue that you mentioned, and you also have your integrity's on the line in a way, even if your grandmother's not still around, or in my case, my mother's not around to say, well, where's the book? I've made the promise, and I know I'm accountable, and my integrity is on the line, even if they're not here because it's sort of in your conscience now. I think that's where it resides.
Yes.
It's now in your conscience, and you can't get rid of it, which is, again, something that is so powerful about a promise. So that's a great story about your grandmother, and how that kind of lingers, and you kind of get drawn back into it, and how you feel. I guess that's the other point I wanted to make, is you feel so happy to have done that, because it would have made your grandmother happy.
Yes,
it's great. Yeah. So but you've also, because you can be very creative with nonfiction stuff, and you do your talks, and you can be creative in how you make your presentations.
Definitely,
yeah.
And also, this brought my creativity back, because the moment I started writing, I realized how many ideas I had,
right.
And I do still write, I do still write fiction sometimes. I realized that where my strength was in really making ideas happen and having ideas, and my ideas just started floating, and they started happening very quickly. So I actually got my creativity back.
And that's where the tapping into what really makes you happy, what your passion is so critical. And so that's another area where I recommend to people that they actually make promises about fulfilling their passion, which is almost literally what you did. You promised your grandmother you would pursue your passion in life. Feel comfortable talking about?
Yes. Well, there is a very much more recent one that has helped me, and I made it to my husband about 3 years ago. And that was when I started writing my first book. He said to me, well, if you are going to spend time with this, you have to promise me that you are going to take it to the end, that you will not drop it, because sometimes it happens, and I talk about it a lot in the new book, which is Ideas in Reality, making your ideas happen. Every project you do has some project, so there comes a point where you get bored with what you're doing, or you don't have resources, or you hit some kind of difficulty, and you just try. You want to give up. And that happens really in most of the projects that anyone starts. And it also happens in relationships sometimes, I find. So we had talked about it, and he said to me, when you hit that plateau point, you have to keep on going, because if you don't, then you're just going to never do this again. And you're just going to go on and with your corporate career and give up the whole writing thing. So you have to finish this book. I'm very happy that I did.
Right. Well, that promise, that was closer to kind of the goal promise, where I promise I'm going to complete this, or I'm going to get this done. I'm going to finish this book. But what's interesting, and this is where, again, the power of the promise helps get us through. And I actually talk about, I've got a little bit of a formula, a simple thing. I call it the GPS system, success system. And the G stands for the goal, and the P stands for promise, and S stands for success. So if you turn a goal into a promise, it leads to success or equals success. And that's also important. The GPS, what does the GPS system do for us? It sort of keeps us on track. It orients us. It gets us moving, keeps us moving in the right direction. And I think that's what a promise does.